There is a particular stillness that settles before a journey begins. In Dragon Ball, that stillness belonged to a boy named Goku, small, fearless, and already remarkable. He carried a dragon radar, a few orange spheres, and a quiet promise. After his first tournament, he set out across a wide world in search of the remaining Dragon Balls. What he found was an army, red uniformed, methodical, and convinced no child could slow them. Their name was the Red Ribbon Army, and tonight we follow their entire story from beginning to end. Before you drift into sleep, you're welcome to subscribe for more calm Dragon Ball stories. And if you feel like it, tell me where you're listening from tonight. And when the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll be giving away a Goku figure. To enter, just subscribe and leave a comment on the pinned post on the channel. The link is in the description. The 21st World Martial Arts Tournament had ended not with a trophy, but with a memory. Goku had fought his way through dozens of opponents, young and untested, guided only by instinct and a kind of quiet confidence that had no particular awareness of itself. He had not won the tournament. He had lost by a single strange technicality involving the moon in a moment of unexpected transformation. But everyone who had watched him understood they had seen something the scoring did not fully capture. His grandfather, a gentleman named Gohan, had raised him deep in the wilderness, far from towns and roads and anything resembling ordinary life. Gohan had given him many things: patience, warmth, a code of honor that was simple and clear and had never needed to be complicated. But the most mysterious thing Gohan had left behind was a small orange sphere with 4 red stars suspended inside it. Goku called it his most precious possession. He wore it on his hat, carried it in his heart, and had never questioned what it really was. When Goku learned what the Dragon Balls were, magical orbs scattered across the world, capable of summoning a wish-granting dragon when all 7 were gathered, he understood, for the first time, why that little sphere had always felt different from ordinary objects. It was not simply a memento, it was one piece of something larger, something that the world had scattered and that he now intended to gather. He would find the Dragon Balls. He would bring his grandfather back. The purpose was simple, and it was entirely his own. It is worth pausing here just for a moment to feel the weight of what that means. A young boy, entirely alone, setting out across a vast and unknown world, not for power, not for glory, for something quiet and personal and very human. That tenderness lived at the center of the Red Ribbon arc. Even as the battles grew louder and the stakes grew higher, it never entirely disappeared. The arc is many things: an adventure, a series of confrontations, a geography of strange and varied places. But underneath all of it, it is a story about a boy who made a promise and kept it. Bulma had built the Dragon Radar herself, a small circular device that could detect the unique electromagnetic signature emitted by each of the 7 Dragon Balls. She was one of the most gifted young scientists in the world, and the radar was perhaps the most elegant proof of that. In Goku's hands, however, it was simply a tool that pointed left or right and told him how far he still had to go. He appreciated it the way he appreciated most useful things, directly, without ceremony, without feeling the need to comment on how remarkable it was. After the tournament concluded, Goku climbed onto the flying Nimbus, a golden cloud given to him by Master Roshi, one that only the pure of heart could ride, and began drifting northeast through air that smelled of pine and open distance. The radar blinked steadily. There was a Dragon Ball somewhere ahead, past the mountains and the river valleys and the stretches of forest that rolled out below him in waves of green and gray. He intended to reach it before anything else reached it first. He had found a few Dragon Balls already during his earliest travels, those early journeys full of wonder and small dangers, encounters with turtle hermits and shapeshifters, and girls with machine guns and things that did not belong to any category he had been prepared for. But this time felt different. Something was already moving toward the same destination, something organized and deliberate and far less innocent than a wandering child on a cloud. The Red Ribbon Army was already in the field, They had their own tracking equipment, rougher than Bulma's, less precise, and they had already recovered one Dragon Ball from somewhere deep in the countryside. Commander Red had dispatched his soldiers in all directions, and the net was quietly closing around the same cluster of stars that Goku was flying toward. Neither of them knew about the other yet, but they would very soon. The area where the six-star Dragon Ball had come to rest was a rocky riverside region, damp and forested, the kind of place where mornings arrived slowly, and the water moved without hurry. Colonel Silver had been camped nearby for several days, along with a pair of subordinates who answered to his every order. Silver was a tall, lean man, methodical, confident, and deeply loyal to the Red Ribbon Army's chain of command. He had been assigned this retrieval because Red trusted him to complete it without incident. When Goku landed near the riverbank and began scanning the area with his dragon radar, Silver's subordinates spotted him first. They told him to move away from the area. Goku did not move. He was already crouching between two mossy rocks, prying loose a small orange ball that the radar was insisting was right there beneath the surface moss. He lifted it, turned it in the light, and felt the familiar low note of mild disappointment. 6 stars. Not his grandfather's 4-star ball. Silver ordered his men to take the Dragon Ball from the child. What happened next surprised everyone present, including perhaps Goku, though Goku showed very little sign of surprise. The first subordinate reached for the Dragon Ball and found himself kicked through the air and into the tree line before he understood what had happened. The second one fired a gun. Goku moved so quickly between the bullets that for a moment he appeared to be simply standing still, the gaps between shots wide enough to walk through if he knew exactly where they were. Colonel Silver himself stepped forward then, removing his coat and adopting a fighting stance with the disciplined precision of someone who had spent years preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation. He told Goku not to underestimate a Red Ribbon colonel. He threw a punch. Goku ducked beneath it. Then Goku used his tail, the long, brown, prehensile tail he had been born with, to sweep Silver across the face, and the colonel crumpled to the ground without another word. It had taken perhaps 40 seconds in total. Silver had been one of the Red Ribbon Army's most capable field officers. He had been dispatched on this mission because Commander Red trusted his competence, and Goku had defeated him more quickly than most people finish reading a short letter. Silver had one last card to play, and he played it from a position of cover and distance. As Goku turned to leave with the 6-star ball tucked safely under his arm, Silver raised a missile launcher from behind cover and fired. The projectile arced through the clear morning air and struck the flying Nimbus directly. The golden cloud that had carried Goku since his earliest adventures exploded in a flash of white and orange light that scattered in all directions and then was simply gone. Goku landed on the ground, unharmed. He always landed unharmed. But when he looked up and found the sky empty, no cloud, no warmth, no gentle buoyancy carrying him above the world, there was something quieter in his expression than anger. He had ridden that cloud for years. It was not just transportation. It was one of the first gifts he had ever been given by someone outside of his grandfather. And it had always responded to him, always found him when he called it, always been reliable in the uncomplicated way of something that did not require maintenance or promises. He looked at Silver and asked, in the straightforward way he asked almost everything, why Silver had destroyed his cloud. Silver had no particularly useful answer. He had assumed it would bring Goku down, and it had not, and now Silver was the one on the ground and Goku was the one standing. Without the Nimbus, Goku had no way to travel efficiently. He had come from the tournament grounds with the cloud as his only means of covering long distances quickly, and without it he was standing in a remote forest with a Dragon Ball in his pocket and a radar pointing at something very far to the north. He checked the distance. It was considerable. He went back to Silver's camp and found a case full of capsules. He opened the case carefully, trying each one in sequence, looking for something practical. Most of them held supplies or weapons or furniture. One of them released a polite, calm robot that seemed happy to be useful. And one of them released a small yellow airplane that the robot offered to pilot on Goku's behalf. Goku accepted the offer without ceremony and climbed in. There was still a Dragon Ball to find, and the North was not going to come closer on its own. Before we follow Goku further north, it is worth pausing to consider the organization he had so casually stumbled into, because it was not a minor criminal outfit or a local gang operating out of a converted warehouse. The Red Ribbon Army was a full military force, ranked, uniformed, equipped with jet fighters and submarines, and fortified bases in every corner of the world. They had spent years building influence through force and intimidation, and by the time Goku first crossed their path, they were one of the most powerful organizations on the planet. The ordinary world moved carefully around them. Governments accommodated them. Populations feared them. Commander Red sat at the top of this structure, a small man in a large chair who wore an eye patch and rarely smiled. He spoke in the clipped, measured tone of someone who expected obedience without asking for it twice. He had built something over many years, an apparatus of power that reached into every geography and every category of operation, and he administered it with the total focus of someone who had no other subjects of interest. The army was not a means to an end for him. It was the expression of a will that had never found another outlet large enough to contain it. Beside him stood his assistant, Staff Officer Black, tall, composed, loyal in the way that only someone who genuinely believes in the larger cause can be loyal. Black handled the day-to-day operational details of the army, while Red concerned himself with the larger picture, the strategic direction, the allocation of resources, the response to failures. Black ran the machine. Red decided where the machine was pointed. The army's coloring was distinctive, red and black everywhere, on uniforms, on vehicles, on the insignia worn by every soldier from the highest general to the lowest foot soldier stationed in the most remote outpost. They had bases in the snow, in the desert, under the ocean. They had fighter pilots and combat specialists and scientists and assassins. They were not accustomed to being challenged by anyone, least of all children. The Dragon Balls had become their most recent and highest priority obsession, and the entire machine had redirected its resources accordingly. What none of them understood, what Red refused to seriously consider, was that a child on a golden cloud was already ahead of them. The airplane climbed steadily northward as the temperature outside the small windows dropped from cool to cold to something colder still. Snow began to appear on the distant peaks, then on the nearer ones, then on the ground below in stretches that grew longer and less interrupted as they flew further into the north. The robot piloting the plane made calm observations about the weather, with the same pleasant neutrality it applied to everything. Goku pressed his face to the glass and watched the white landscape pass beneath him with the attentive interest he brought to places he had never been. He had never been this far north before. The Dragon Ball, somewhere below, waiting under all that snow and silence, was the 5-star ball, though he would not confirm this until he held it. The radar was pointing toward a cluster of simple structures, half buried in the drifts. A small village, barely visible against the hillside, as still and quiet as everything else in this pale and distant part of the world. Jingle Village had a name that carried a gentleness not entirely matched by its circumstances. The people who lived there had built their lives around the rhythms of a northern winter. Modest homes, warm fires, a closeness that comes from living near difficult weather for generations. They were farmers and craftspeople and families, and they were ordinary in the way that most of the people in Goku's world were ordinary, doing their best with what they had, expecting neither catastrophe nor miracle from any given day. They had not expected the Red Ribbon Army either, but the army had arrived anyway and imposed itself on their lives with the comfortable arrogance of an organization that did not need permission. But something had changed in Jingle Village's ordinary rhythms before Goku arrived. The village had fallen under the shadow of Muscle Tower, and nothing had been ordinary since. Muscle Tower rose from the snow a short distance from the village, a concrete monolith of several stories that looked exactly like what it was, a military installation designed to dominate the surrounding landscape with its presence alone. The Red Ribbon Army had built it there and staffed it with General White, one of their northern commanders. General White had organized raids on Jingle Village, and taken the village elder hostage, holding him inside the tower as leverage to ensure the villagers would not resist any of the army's operations in the region. The village mayor, a round, bundled figure who clearly missed warmth very badly and had been surviving on stoic resignation for quite some time, explained all of this to Goku when the boy landed his small plane in the snow and walked over to ask where the Dragon Ball was. The mayor was frightened, in the particular way that people become frightened when they have been afraid for a long time and have run out of hope that the fear will resolve. His people had been living under this shadow for weeks. The elder was gone. The army soldiers had come and gone at will. No one had been able to do anything, and no one had come to help. Goku listened to the mayor with the patient attention he gave to most things. He did not ask many questions. He did not express sympathy in a way that would have seemed practiced or formal. When the mayor finished, Goku asked which building the elder was in. The mayor pointed at the tower. Goku nodded, thanked him, and walked in that direction. There is something quietly remarkable about Goku's approach to obstacles, and it deserves a moment's recognition. He does not plan in the way strategists plan. He does not calculate odds or consider retreats or model outcomes. He looks at the problem, determines what needs to be done, and begins walking toward it. In a tower full of trained red ribbon soldiers, behind layers of fortification and armed response, this quality was going to be tested thoroughly. It was not going to be found wanting. The first floors of Muscle Tower were guarded by standard red ribbon soldiers, armed, uniformed, and entirely unprepared for what they were about to encounter. Goku moved through them with the same fluid ease he had shown against Colonel Silver, deflecting each attack with the minimum necessary redirection, responding to each opponent with something precisely calibrated to end the encounter quickly and move to the next. He was not careless, but he was never worried. The worry would have required him to consider the possibility that he would fail, and that consideration had not occurred to him. General White watched from the upper floors on his monitors, directing his men and growing increasingly agitated as each defense failed. He deployed a fighter named Sergeant Major Purple, a ninja-style combatant who used tricks and misdirection and hidden weapons with considerable skill. Purple was fast, adaptable, and clever. He survived longer than most of the soldiers below him, but he could not keep up with Goku's instincts and eventually found himself similarly set aside. On one of the higher floors, Goku encountered something different. A large, gray-skinned being who looked mechanical in some places and organic in others, with a frame built for power and a face that communicated something harder to read than simple threat. The being did not attack immediately. It stood quietly, watching Goku with what seemed, after a moment's attention, to be uncertainty. It had been placed there to stop intruders, but it seemed, for a moment, to be asking itself what it was actually supposed to be. Whether stopping this boy was what it was actually for. This was Android 8, and the question he was asking himself was going to have a very particular answer. Android 8, known later and affectionately as Aider, was one of the Red Ribbon Army's experimental creations from their Android development program. The Army's scientists have been working for years on the combination of mechanical components with biological matter, producing beings that existed somewhere between human and machine, engineered for combat and durability. Aider was one of the results of that program. He had been built for war. His body was enormous, and his strength, when applied, was capable of leveling walls. He had been designed as a weapon, and the designation was not metaphorical. But Aider did not want to fight. He had never wanted to fight. The gentleness inside him seemed to have arrived without invitation, appearing as a kind of inevitable consequence of the act of creating a person, even a person made partly of machine. You could build a body, you could program reflexes and install disruptive capabilities and calibrate combat responses. What you could not fully control, it seemed, was whether the person you had built would choose to use any of it. When General White ordered Aider to destroy Goku, Aider refused. The refusal was quiet and absolute, delivered with a softness that stood in strange contrast to his physical size. White threatened him, reminded him that there was a bomb installed somewhere inside his body, a failsafe that could be triggered remotely if he disobeyed orders. Aider remained still. He acknowledged the threat and continued to refuse. He was not going to hurt the boy. Not for White's orders, not for the army's program, not for anything. Goku, who tended to recognize sincerity when he encountered it, and who had not yet learned to distrust things simply because they were large and gray and made partly of machine, recognized it clearly in Aether. The two of them made their way upward through the remaining floors of Muscle Tower together, an unlikely pair consisting of a child with a tail and a gentle giant who moved carefully through the corridors, as if conscious of how much space he took up. Goku offered Aether his friendship in the uncomplicated, direct way Goku offered most things, and Aether, perhaps for the first time in his brief existence, accepted something that was not in order. At the top of Muscle Tower, General White waited with the village elder. White was not a particularly distinguished villain. He had no great philosophy, no grand ambition beyond carrying out his orders and maintaining his position within the army hierarchy. He was efficient in the way that bureaucratic cruelty is efficient, organized, detached, and entirely willing to use other people's suffering as a tool toward other ends. He had the elder. He had the bomb inside Aether. Those two facts, he believed, were enough leverage to get whatever he needed. What he had not accounted for was that Goku was not the kind of person who responds to leverage. The concept of a threat aimed at someone else, the idea that harm to another person might cause Goku to stand down or change course, was fundamentally incompatible with how Goku had been raised. You did not abandon someone to protect yourself. That was not something Gohan had ever taught him, and it was not something Goku had ever arrived at through his own reasoning. It simply had not occurred to him as a viable option. When White activated the remote trigger for Aether's internal bomb, nothing happened. Goku had already located and removed the device, a small component concealed in Aether's back, during an earlier moment in their progress through the tower. White had been holding a card that was no longer in his hand. He was, in the end, simply a man in a room at the top of a building, and Goku took care of him with the same focused efficiency he had applied to every floor below. The village elder was returned to Jingle Village. Muscle Tower fell quiet. The soldiers who had terrorized the villagers for so long were no longer a threat. Aether stayed behind in the village, choosing to remain among the people there, not because he had nowhere else to go, but because this was where he wanted to be. A gentle creature had found, in the most unlikely of circumstances, something that resembled a home. The village received him, as villages sometimes receive the unexpected, carefully at first, and then, over time, simply. Back at the Red Ribbon Army's central headquarters, Commander Red received the news about Muscle Tower in the manner that powerful men with fragile egos often receive bad news, with fury directed at everyone in the vicinity except himself. The monitors showed a northern outpost gone silent. The reports confirmed the pattern he had been watching develop for the past several days. Another general, another base, another failure. Silver was already gone, executed by Red's own order for his failure to retrieve the Dragon Ball from a child. The execution had been carried out calmly and without ceremony, communicated over a radio signal to a subordinate at Silver's location, who had simply followed the order. It had been a reminder to every officer in the army of what failure meant in Commander Red's organization. You did not lose to a child. You did not come back with excuses. You came back with results, or the consequences were exactly what the order said they were. Now White had failed as well. The tower was gone. The soldiers stationed there had been defeated or dispersed. The Dragon Ball that had been the whole point of maintaining a fortified presence in that frozen corner of the world was still somewhere in that child's possession, moving further away with every passing hour. Red stared at his screens and spoke in a very low voice, which was always more frightening than shouting. He instructed Staff Officer Black to redirect resources. He wanted General Blue to take over. Blue was different from Silver or White. He was not simply competent in the military sense. He was fastidious, precise, and operated with a cold intensity that made even other Red Ribbon officers careful about how they behaved in his presence. He had a record of results. He had never failed an assignment in a way he had not managed to redeem in the subsequent attempt. If anyone in the army was going to deal with this child and recover the Dragon Balls, Commander Red believed it would be Blue. While Goku was working his way through the frozen architecture of Muscle Tower, the story was also unfolding elsewhere. Bulma, resourceful, impatient, and entirely unwilling to sit quietly while interesting things happened nearby, had found her way into the Ark again, moving through a coastal region east of Master Roshi's island, with her own set of circumstances and the Dragon radar readings she was still monitoring from a distance. Krillin was with her. Krillin, Goku's friend and sometime training partner from their shared time under Master Roshi, was small and bald and possessed of a competitive spirit that slightly exceeded his confidence in most circumstances. He cared about Goku. He cared about doing the right thing when the right thing presented itself clearly enough to act on. And he was, when situations demanded it, genuinely brave, not in the way of someone who does not feel fear, but in the more honest way of someone who feels it completely and decides to proceed regardless. The two of them had been moving through a coastal area when they found themselves in territory the Red Ribbon Army had been using as a staging ground. General Blue's fleet operated from an island facility in that region, and the Army's patrols had been covering the area carefully. Bulma and Krillin's presence was noted, but neither of them knew that yet, and neither of them was primarily thinking about the Army. They were thinking about the Dragon Ball reading that the radar was returning from somewhere beneath the water's surface. Something old, something deep, something that had apparently been sitting in the dark for a very long time. The pirates had built it, the sea had preserved it, and whatever was at the center of it had been waiting, without anyone to witness the waiting, for longer than anyone currently alive could remember. The cave opened beneath the surface of the water, accessible through a submerged passage that required either exceptional luck or exceptional navigation to locate and enter. Inside, built by pirates who had been gone for generations, was a labyrinth of tunnels and chambers and traps that had been designed with a single specific intention, preventing anyone from reaching what was stored at the center. The pirates who built this place had been serious people in the serious business of keeping things hidden. They had not been careless architects. The traps were elaborate, pressure plates, hidden blades, flooding chambers, mechanisms that responded to movement or weight or the disturbance of specific surfaces. They had been designed without planned maintenance and maintained by no one since the pirates disappeared. Time had not been kind to everything, but enough of the mechanisms still functioned to make the cave genuinely dangerous in a way that required full attention and some degree of luck to navigate without serious consequence. At the center of the labyrinth was a treasure chamber, and inside that chamber, among the accumulated wealth of a pirate operation that had ended generations ago, rested an orange ball with 3 red stars inside it. 3 stars, one of the 7. It had been in the dark all this time, and the radar had found it. And now 2 teenagers were working their way through flooding stone corridors toward it, while a large mechanical guardian built by those same long-dead pirates moved through the tunnels with grinding purpose. The cave received Bulma and Krillin without ceremony and activated everything it had. The traps came alive in sequence, and the water in the lower sections began to rise. It was enormous and old, and built with the specific intention of never failing at the one thing it existed to do. The pirates had applied to this guardian the same philosophy they had applied to their traps. Built to last, built to deter, built to end any attempt to reach the treasure before anyone got close enough to genuinely threaten it. The robot moved through the stone corridors with slow, grinding inevitability, the kind of pace that is more frightening than speed because it implies something that does not need to hurry, something that has never failed to catch up eventually. Krillin was not thrilled about the situation, and he said so, which was entirely consistent with his honest relationship with danger. He knew when he was frightened. He admitted it freely, and then he fought anyway, which was a kind of courage that tended not to receive the same ceremonial recognition as courage performed without visible fear, but was arguably more difficult. Bulma kept moving forward. Bulma's relationship with obstacles was characterized by a fundamental refusal to be stopped by them, even when the obstacles were mechanical guardians the size of a small vehicle. moving through corridors that were already filling with water. She had Dragon Ball coordinates on a radar and a personal philosophy that tended toward forward movement in most circumstances, and she was going to follow both. The robot was eventually overcome, not without difficulty, not without the kind of desperate improvisation that Krillin's training made possible even under pressure. The two of them pressed further into the cave, into the silence and the dark, through passages that grew more still as they approached the center, toward a chamber that had been keeping its contents safe for the last and longest chapter of a very long vigil. General Blue was already on his way. He was tall and blond, meticulous in his uniforminous posture, carrying himself with the disciplined precision of someone who had applied as much effort to his appearance as to every other aspect of his professional existence. He commanded the kind of respect that comes from controlled intensity, the kind that makes people in proximity careful about how they move and speak. He was also, by the standards of the Red Ribbon Army's officer corps, extraordinarily effective at the things the Army valued most. Blue had deployed his forces to cover the coastal area and had received intelligence confirming that unauthorized individuals had entered the cave system. He took this personally. The Dragon Ball inside that cave was within his operational territory. Unauthorized individuals were, by definition, a problem requiring his direct attention and his direct response. He descended into the cave with a team of soldiers, moving with efficiency through the early passages. What he had not accounted for was a boy dropping through the ceiling and landing between him and the treasure chamber. Goku had been tracking the Dragon Ball on his own radar, via a separate route through the cave system, moving through passages that Blue's team had not covered. He appeared without warning, as he tended to do, and his presence created complications that none of Blue's operational planning had anticipated. The general assessed the child in front of him with the practiced evaluation of someone who categorized threats quickly and responded accordingly. He saw a young boy with a tail and a round orange device. He assigned a threat level that was not high enough. Goku and General Blue faced each other in a stone corridor beneath the sea, with water beginning to find its way through cracks in the floor and the distant sounds of the cave's mechanisms still operating somewhere behind them. Blue studied the child with the measured attention of someone building a tactical file. Goku looked at Blue with the open, uncomplicated curiosity he brought to most new faces. Neither of them had the benefit of knowing yet exactly what the other was capable of. Blue was powerful. This was not a matter of reputation or rank alone. It was a physical fact, earned through years of rigorous training that had shaped his body into something considerably more capable than his composed presentation might suggest. He struck with precision and speed, and when he connected, the impact carried genuine force. He was not Silver or Sergeant Major Purple. He occupied a different and higher category of threat, and he had something beyond physical capability, something that no amount of speed or strength could counter in the usual way. Blue possessed a psychic ability. When he concentrated his gaze on an opponent with full focus and will, that opponent became unable to move, not simply unwilling. AAFL. Every muscle locked, every reflex stalled. The body stopped responding to the mind's instructions entirely, as if the conversation between intention and action had been severed at the source. When Blue used this ability on Goku, Goku went completely still. His arms hung at his sides. His feet remained exactly where they were. He could think. He could see. He could form intentions. He simply could not make anything happen. For a few long seconds it appeared that General Blue had solved the problem completely. The child was frozen. The Dragon Ball was retrievable. The operation could proceed as planned. What saved Goku was absurd and small and completely consistent with how the world of Dragon Ball had always operated at its best. A mouse appeared. Blue had a phobia of mice, a detail so incongruous with his rigid, controlled, meticulously maintained persona that it existed in a category beyond simple irony. But it was real. It was a fact of his psychology, specific and involuntary. And when the mouse emerged from somewhere in the stone wall and crossed the floor near Blue's feet, his concentration broke instantly. The focused will behind his psychic ability shattered like a window struck from outside. the lock released. Goku moved immediately. He did not pause to process the absurdity of the moment. He did not find it funny, though in some other context he might have. He moved because movement was what the situation called for, and he had been preparing his response during every second he had been standing frozen, reviewing everything he had seen of Blue's fighting patterns and waiting for the moment the hold released. The exchange that followed was brief and entirely decisive. Blue struck the stone wall. The confrontation ended. The Dragon Ball was in the chamber. Goku reached it. He took it. He tucked it with the others and turned back the way he had come, looking for Bulma and Krillin and a way out of a cave that was very clearly beginning to flood in earnest now. The ancient mechanisms that had managed to function for all these generations were finally giving way, and the water was rising through the lower passages with the calm, unstoppable patience of something that has all the time in the world. The escape from the cave was managed rather than elegant. The submarine that Blue's forces had brought through the underwater entrance to the cave was the means. Not comfortable, not designed for people who had just run through a flooded labyrinth, but present and functional. They surfaced into gray coastal light and open air, and for a moment the relief of being above the water and out of the dark was large enough to sit with in silence. Blue had not been finished. He surfaced not long after them, found his own way to surface transportation, and followed. He was going to find where the child's associates lived. He was going to find the dragon radar. He was going to recover what he had failed to recover in the cave, and he was going to do it at a location where he controlled the situation from the beginning. He followed the trail back toward the small island where Master Roshi kept his house. Kame House, the familiar island of palm trees and flat blue water, received the arriving group in the way it always had, with the smell of salt air and the sound of waves against the small shore and turtles somewhere nearby being peaceable. The people inside were glad to see Bulma and Krillin return. They were less glad when Blue's arrival made the situation urgent again. What Blue had not accounted for, in his planning, was Master Roshi. The old man wore sunglasses indoors and moved as if his joints had philosophical objections to the enterprise of movement. He had the aspect of someone who had given up on several categories of effort and was perfectly content with that decision. This was a very carefully maintained performance, sustained through decades of deliberate understatement. The man beneath it had trained under the turtle school for longer than Blue had been alive, and what he could do when something threatened his home was not visible from the performance. Blue discovered this. Blue departed from the island. The Dragon Balls remained where they were. Commander Red did not receive the Blue situation as another manageable setback. He received it as evidence that the Army's internal resources were no longer sufficient for this particular problem. The child was extraordinary in a way that the Army's conventional tools had consistently failed to address. Conventional military force had been applied through multiple qualified officers and had produced no lasting results. Something different was required. Red made a phone call. Mercenary Tao was not a red ribbon soldier. He was not part of any organizational structure or chain of command. He was an independent contractor, a professional assassin who operated entirely alone, charged fees that reflected a market position of 1, and had a record of completing assignments that other people had categorized as impossible. He was, by the informal consensus of everyone who had worked with him and survived the experience, the most dangerous person alive. He was also entirely aware of this assessment and found it accurate. He arrived by airplane, or rather by being launched out of an airplane at altitude and landing comfortably, which was not a detail intended as performance so much as simply how he chose to travel. He met with Commander Red in a manner that suggested he was doing Red a favor by being present at all. He reviewed the briefing with the attention of someone who had seen many briefings, and found most of them insufficient. He specified that payment would be made before delivery, not after, and that the terms were non-negotiable. He was given a photograph of the child. He was given coordinates. He was given everything the Army had, because the Army had recognized by this point that it had run out of options of its own. Tao left to find Goku. The plains waited. The sacred land of Korin waited. and a large, quiet man named Bora was standing at the base of a stone tower watching his son play, with no knowledge at all of what was coming in his direction. The area around the base of Korin Tower was a vast open plain, the kind of landscape that feels larger than it actually is, because the sky above it is unobstructed and the horizon extends equally in all directions without interruption. A pillar of stone rose from this plain with impossible height, its top disappearing above the clouds. This was Korin Tower, one of the most significant locations in the geography of the Dragon Ball world, though it did not look significant from the ground. It looked like a very tall piece of rock. A man named Bora lived there with his son, Upa. Bora was enormous in a way that suggested not just physical size, but something more fundamental, a solidity, a rootedness, the quality of someone who has been in a place for a long time and has no plans to leave. He and Upa lived simply at the base of the tower, the protectors of a place they considered sacred, unwilling to move and unwilling to be displaced by the army's previous attempts to establish operations in the area. The army had tried before. Bora had stopped them. Goku arrived on foot, crossing the open plains after his journey from the north, still carrying his Dragon Balls, still following the radar toward whatever it indicated next. He met Upa first, a small, quiet boy with attentive eyes, who watched visitors carefully and gave very little away until he had decided what he thought of them. Upa had a quality of stillness that was unusual in a child, the kind of stillness that comes from spending most of one's time in an open landscape with a parent who moved unhurriedly. Bora looked at Goku and decided, with the directness of someone who had developed good instincts about people over many years in a remote location, that this one was trustworthy. It was the kind of judgment that could be made quickly and turned out to be correct. He welcomed Goku. He answered his questions. He asked none in return that were not immediately relevant. The three of them spent a brief time together in the plain at the base of the tower, in the uncomplicated way of people who have not yet been introduced to the event that is going to change everything. Mercenary Tao arrived at Korin's base without ceremony and without any apparent adjustment in behavior for the fact that there were civilians present. He surveyed the area with the professional attention of someone assessing a work environment. He identified Goku. He identified Bora as an obstacle between himself and his primary objective. He proceeded accordingly. What followed was unjust and brief. Bora was not a match for Tao. Almost no one alive was a match for Tao. That was the specific purpose of hiring him, the premium embedded in his fee. Bora was strong and experienced and genuinely formidable by ordinary standards. But Tao was not operating by ordinary standards. The encounter lasted long enough for Bora to demonstrate clearly that he was not going to stand aside. And then it was over. Appa's cry at the edge of the plain carried across the open landscape without softening. Goku had been nearby when it happened. He moved toward Tao immediately, with a quality in his movement that was different from the focused calm he usually brought to confrontations. This was personal in a way that most things were not personal to Goku, because grief and anger had arrived together and had not resolved into anything clean before he was already moving. He did not calculate. He responded. Tao deflected him. Goku was fast, faster by this point than almost anyone Tao had encountered in a long career of encountering capable people. But Tao was faster. The exchange was long enough for Goku to register, with a part of him that was still observing even while the rest of him was entirely committed to the fight, that he was not winning. He was not losing quickly, but he was not winning, and the gap between them was real. Tao struck Goku with enough concentrated force to send him into the earth, and Goku did not get up. Tao left. He had retrieved the Dragon Ball that Goku had been carrying. He had completed the relevant portion of his commission. He departed with the indifference of someone who had done difficult things so many times that the difficulty had ceased to register as anything requiring particular acknowledgement. Upa stayed beside Goku's still body for a time that would have felt very long to anyone watching it. The plain was quiet. The tower rose behind them in its impossible height, disappearing into the clouds above, its top invisible, its purpose unknown to anyone who had not been told. There was only the wind and the grass, and the sound of Upa's breathing and the complete, undramatic stillness of the body on the ground. And then Goku moved, not fully conscious, not fully recovered, but present enough to breathe and to look up and to take in the stone column rising above him. He had heard of Korin Tower. Stories filter through the world of fighters about places that are significant, places that can change you if you are willing to do what the place requires. At the top of this tower, there was water. Water that could dramatically increase a person's capability. Water that had changed every person who had ever successfully drunk it. Water that had been guarded for centuries by something ancient and patient and not at all interested in making the path to it easy. He began to climb. The tower was not a staircase. It was smooth stone with no artificial footholds, nothing but the irregularities of the rock's natural surface. Shallow cracks, narrow ledges, places where the stone had fractured slightly and left a grip available if you knew how to use it. Goku used it. The ground fell away beneath him. The plains receded, the sky grew closer, the tower rose and rose, and he climbed, and the cold increased as he went higher. And his hands found each grip before he consciously looked for it, because his body had been trained to notice things that his mind had not yet processed. At the top of Korin Tower, above the cloud line and above the world, was a small circular space filled with plants and the smell of something old and deeply still. The smell, perhaps, of a place that had been inhabited for 800 years by someone who had no particular urgency about anything. A cat sat in the middle of it, large for a cat, carrying a cane that seemed to be decorative in the same way that a crown is decorative, not because it was unnecessary, but because it signaled something about the wearer's relationship to the world. Korin was not what most people expected. He was casual in a way that was genuinely unsettling, because it was not the casualness of someone who did not care. It was the casualness of someone who had sufficient perspective that the things most people found urgent did not seem particularly urgent from where he was standing. He had watched fighters come to the top of this tower for centuries. Most of them arrived wanting something specific. He responded to them with the patience of someone who understood that the wanting was usually not the point, and that the point was usually something they had not arrived knowing they were looking for. He had the pot. He told Goku that the ultra-divine water was inside it, and that the task was simple. Take it from him. This was not a test of strength. Korin moved with the unpredictable fluidity of a cat who had been alive long enough to have developed a relationship with time that ordinary beings could not access. He went where he chose. He was never where you expected. He was already somewhere else by the time your intention to move had reached your muscles. Goku chased him for 3 days, or perhaps longer. The count on Korin Tower is not always reliable, existing as it does slightly outside the ordinary current of time. He grew not more frustrated, but more attentive, more present, more quiet inside. The chasing was teaching him something he could not have learned from being told about it. Eventually, not by force, not by superior speed, but by a quality of observation that had been developing in Goku throughout those days of pursuit, he reached the pot. He held it. The water inside was ordinary water, Korin then revealed. The ultra-divine water was not what had been in the pot. The test had never been about the pot. The test had been the chasing itself, the sustained attention, the willingness to fail repeatedly without adjusting the objective, the development of something that could only be called awareness. The pursuit had built something in Goku already, without announcing that it was building it. But there was something else. Korin had not mentioned the second water until now, because most people who arrived at the top of the tower were not ready to hear about it. The actual ultra-divine water was stored separately and was, in truth, genuinely dangerous, not as a test of character, literally, physically dangerous. The poison inside it was potent enough to kill anyone who did not possess, buried somewhere beneath their accumulated training and experience, the dormant potential to withstand it. Most people who drank it died. Korin did not recommend it to people casually. Goku drank it without significant deliberation. He had climbed the tower for a reason, and the reason was waiting below in the form of a man who had killed someone he had just met and who needed to be stopped before he harmed anyone else. He felt what that kind of poison feels like, the body arguing with itself, the two things occupying the same narrow space, the outcome entirely uncertain for a long and uncomfortable period. And then the uncertainty resolved in one direction. He stood up. Something in the quality of the air around him had changed, not dramatically, not with announcement, but unmistakably. The change was real. Korin confirmed this in his own way, which was quiet and without ceremony. Goku descended. The planes waited below. Goku descended Korin Tower more quickly than he had climbed it, which was saying something considerable. He landed at the base and found Upa where he had left him, sitting near the place where his father had fallen, carrying the kind of patience that grief acquires when it has been sitting with itself for long enough to stop announcing itself. Goku told Upa that he was going to gather the Dragon Balls and bring Bora back. He said this in the way he said most things that he intended to do, as information, not as reassurance. Mercenary Tao was already returning. He had delivered the Dragon Ball he had retrieved from Goku and had been instructed to deal with the child conclusively. Loose ends in Commander Red's operation were not left loose. Tao arrived at the base of the tower with the confidence of a man who had assessed an opponent once, found him manageable, and saw no reason to revise that assessment for a second encounter. Goku stood in his path. The difference in the quality of the silence between them was immediately apparent, and Tao, who had extensive experience with silence of various kinds, registered it. He had built a file on this child from their first encounter. He knew the speed, the reach, the timing of the counterattacks, the way the boy moved in the moment before a strike. He had prepared for what he remembered. What he found in front of him did not match the file. The fight was brief in the way that clearly decided things tend to be brief. Tao was not simply beaten. He was shown, with the economy and clarity of someone who had stopped needing to prove a point and simply needed to end a situation, that his understanding of the situation was no longer current. The Dragon Ball was recovered. Tao was removed from the field in a way that left the question of his continued existence technically uncertain, though the important thing for Goku's purposes was that he was no longer between Goku and the next thing. If you're still awake halfway through, maybe subscribe before you drift off, and tell me what time it is where you're watching from. The 7th. The one Bulma's radar would eventually fail to detect, sitting inside the digestive system of some large animal somewhere in the world, was still somewhere. But the 6th was in the hands of the Red Ribbon Army, secured in their central headquarters by Commander Red himself, and retrieving it was the next necessary step. The headquarters of the Red Ribbon Army was not a hidden location. It was large and prominently situated, defended by layers of soldiers, anti-aircraft systems, surveillance equipment, and the institutional confidence of an organization that had not been seriously challenged from outside in years. No coherent individual assault had ever been attempted against it. No one had ever seriously entertained the idea that a single attacker could accomplish anything meaningful against a fully staffed military base. No one had run the calculations for a situation in which the attacker was Goku. The flying Nimbus had found its way back to Goku, called by the whistle Master Roshi had given him, emerging from the sky as if it had simply been waiting for the signal, patient and unchanged. He climbed onto it and turned toward the headquarters, following the radar's indication of the 6th ball's location. The base appeared on the horizon at a considerable distance, its structures visible against the sky, its perimeter fortifications bristling with the specific quality of a place that believed itself impregnable. He was alone. He had been offered help by his friends, who had assembled a plan and equipped themselves accordingly. He had declined, not out of confidence in the theatrical sense, but out of the genuine feeling that he did not want anyone else hurt on his behalf, and out of the quiet certainty that this was something he needed to do in the same unambiguous way he needed to breathe or eat. He descended toward the outer perimeter, and the alarm systems came alive. The Red Ribbon Army's headquarters mobilized the moment its sensors detected the incoming threat. Jet fighters launched from the runway installations. Anti-aircraft batteries turned on their mounts and elevated. Infantry deployed to defensive positions. Alarms cascaded through the compound in layers, each layer activating the next, filling the base with the purposeful urgency of an organization that had drilled for this scenario. The response was, by every military standard, fast and disciplined and comprehensive. Goku moved through all of it. He moved through the fighters by occupying the spaces the fighters were not by calculation exactly, but by the kind of continuous spatial processing that had become as unconscious for him as walking. He was always already where the next attack was not going to arrive. He moved through the perimeter defenses by moving through them, because the defenses had been designed to stop vehicles and formations and ground-based threats, not something that moved the way Goku moved. The soldiers in the outer compound encountered him in ways that depended on where they were. Those in the outer ring had the most time to prepare, which meant they had the most time to organize a response, which meant they had the most time to experience the realization that their response was not going to work. Those in the intersections encountered him more suddenly. The encounters were briefer in proportion. There is a particular quality to the stillness that follows an extended battle that is different from other kinds of stillness. It is not the triumphant stillness of a story's intended climax. It is the quieter stillness of aftermath, the silence that settles when a thing has ended and the world is still adjusting to the fact. Goku moved through the Red Ribbon Army's central headquarters for what felt in the telling like a long time, though in practice the duration was not great. He was efficient. He was calm. He was finishing something that had begun with a boy's promise at the base of a stone tower. The upper levels of the headquarters contained the Dragon Balls that Red had recovered, secured in the operations room among the screens and communications equipment and the accumulated evidence of months of military campaign. Red watched Goku moving through his base on the monitors with an expression that had moved through several stages and arrived somewhere difficult to read. He was not frightened in the way that ordinary people are frightened. He was something closer to cornered. Black stood beside him, watching the same screens. He had been with Red for a long time. He had executed Red's orders and believed in Red's vision and dedicated himself to the army with the commitment of someone who had made the army the primary structure of meaning in their life. He had never questioned what the Dragon Balls were ultimately for. He had assumed, because it was the only assumption that made all the sacrifices coherent, that they were for world domination. That was what the powerful gathered magical wish-granting artifacts to accomplish. They gathered them to remake the world in their image, to impose their will on the existing arrangement, to take what existed and reshape it in accordance with their own requirements. Black had spent years helping Red pursue that goal. He had organized operations and dispatched officers and managed the army's enormous machine in service of what he believed was a shared vision. He had watched Silver executed for a child's defeat and had absorbed that fact without comment, because the mission demanded it. He had watched Blue's failures accumulate and had continued managing the machine without letting the accumulation affect his focus. He had done all of this because he believed in what the Red Ribbon Army was ultimately for. Red spoke finally in a voice very low and steady about what the Dragon Balls were for. He wanted to be taller. Black remained standing. He did not make a sound. He was still wearing the same composed expression he always wore in the operations room. But something behind his eyes went entirely still in a way it had not been still before. The specific stillness of a person who has just heard something that does not fit into any available category, and who is taking the time to verify that they have heard it correctly before responding. Commander Red had a particular relationship with his height. He was short, shorter than most people around him, shorter than he felt his position required, shorter in ways that had accumulated into a wound over the course of a life that had been, in many respects, a sustained attempt to outrun the feeling of being small. He had been laughed at as a child. He had been dismissed as a young man. He had accumulated power and fear and institutional authority on a scale that most people could not have imagined, and none of it had quieted the part of him that remembered every instance of dismissal. He had built an army. He had sent hundreds of soldiers into the field. He had executed officers who disappointed him. He had terrorized populations and used living people as instruments of policy and pursued magical artifacts across the entire surface of a planet. He had done all of this, ultimately, not to rule the world, but to change one specific physical characteristic that he had been unable to accept for as long as he had been alive. Black asked, very quietly, whether this was true. Red said that it was. Black asked whether everything that had been lost and built and sacrificed had been in service of this one personal desire. Red said that the army could have ruled the world without the Dragon Balls. The Dragon Balls were for him. There was a silence in the room that had a particular weight. Black reached a limit he had not known existed, until he arrived at it. What happened next was not planned. It was also, in its own way, entirely inevitable. The result of a long accumulation of loyalty being tested against a single revelation that made the loyalty itself feel like something that had been taken under false pretenses. Black acted. Commander Red did not continue after that. He had occupied that chair for years, directing an operation of enormous scale and consequence, and now he was no longer directing anything. The room was quiet. The screen still showed the activity below in the compound. Black stood in the center of a situation that had just fundamentally changed and processed it with the same controlled attention he applied to everything. He declared himself the new commander. He declared that the army would do what it had always been supposed to do, what he had always believed it was doing, what had made all the sacrifices meaningful. The world would be remade. The Red Ribbon Army would rule it. He would accomplish what Red had diverted the machine away from. He would deal with the child himself, directly with the best resource the Army's engineering program had produced. Goku appeared at the door. The timing had a quality of coincidence, so complete it approached something else, the boy arriving at the exact moment that one era had ended and a new one was still forming its shape. He looked at Black, he looked at the screens, he looked around the room with the direct, unhurried assessment he brought to unfamiliar spaces. He asked, plainly, where the Dragon Balls were. Black was not in a simple mood. Staff Officer Black was a genuinely capable fighter, not at the level of a professional assassin or a lifelong martial arts master, but stronger and faster than most people, with the kind of confidence that decades of high-level military command can install in a person's physical bearing. Under different circumstances, a confrontation with Goku would have been a real confrontation. Under the circumstances currently existing, it was not, and Black recognized this within the first few exchanges. He reached for a different solution. The battle jacket was the Army's most advanced mechanical weapon, a large armored mech suit built around a pilot who commanded it from the inside, converting human capability into something operating at a different scale entirely. Black climbed into it and sealed it around him and became something larger. The suit had armor plating, speed enhancement systems, weapons arrays, and structural integrity designed to absorb punishment that would destroy ordinary military vehicles. It made him physically larger. It made the impact of every strike carry the weight of machinery rather than muscle. It made him, in short, the kind of opponent that a person Goku's age and size was not supposed to be able to overcome. The fight that followed moved through the compound's upper levels and eventually out onto the exterior terraces. Black drove the battle jacket with genuine aggression and skill, landing impacts that sent Goku through walls and structural sections of the building. Goku was being hit in ways that would have decisively ended the fight against almost any other opponent. He kept getting up. And then he found the rhythm of it, the timing and the pattern, and the small windows inside the jacket's attack sequences, where the suit was fully committed to a trajectory and therefore could not also be defending. Those moments were narrow. They were enough. Goku moved into one of them and applied what he found there with everything he had. The battle jacket failed catastrophically at multiple structural points in the same brief moment, and the explosion that followed was large enough to alter the upper section of the compound's architecture permanently. Black was not alive after it. Goku stood in the wreckage and looked around with the quiet, thorough assessment he brought to the end of most things. Not triumph, not satisfaction. Something quieter, the checking quality of someone who wants to be sure nothing has been missed before they turn their attention to what comes next. He gathered the Dragon Balls from the operations room where Red had kept them, checking each one against the radar. 6 balls, he had 5 before, and the army had 1. Now he had 6. He carried them carefully, individually confirming each one, holding them with the particular attention of someone who understood what each orange sphere was worth and what it cost to lose track of any of them. The Red Ribbon Army was over, not retreating to rebuild, not dispersed to regroup elsewhere, over. The organization that had spent months pursuing these same objects, that had deployed an entire military infrastructure in their direction, that had executed its own officers for failure and terrorized populations across multiple regions, and hired the most dangerous person alive to stop a child. All of that was behind him now, quiet and still and finished. The child who had ended it had done so not out of any grand plan or personal ambition, but because a man named Bora had been killed by the army's hired assassin, and Goku had promised a quiet boy named Upa that he would bring his father back. That was the whole of it. That was the size of the thing that had defeated them. Yamcha arrived at the headquarters not long after Goku's assault had concluded. He had come with Bulma and the others, responding to the general understanding that Goku might require help against an organization with the resources and personnel of the Red Ribbon Army. He had coordinated an approach strategy. He had thought carefully about it. He had prepared. He looked at the compound. He sent a small remote aircraft ahead to survey the interior and confirm what the exterior suggested. The aircraft returned. Its reconnaissance confirmed that the Red Ribbon Army had been comprehensively defeated and that Goku was standing in the wreckage of the central operations room, holding 6 Dragon Balls and examining the Dragon radar with a slight frown. Yamcha held this information quietly for a moment. He had arrived to help fight an army. The army was gone. He had trained under Master Roshi and pushed his capabilities considerably since the tournament. Goku had not needed any of it. He carried this fact with the specific combination of frustration and genuine admiration that Goku tended to produce in people who cared about him, and also competed with him, and which did not resolve into either feeling cleanly but sat between them. Krillin had precisely the same thought, expressed in a slightly different tone. They had both come to help, and they had not been needed to help. And this was becoming a familiar pattern that both of them were going to need to find a way to make peace with if they were going to keep training toward goals that included someday being competitive with Goku in a tournament setting. Bulma looked at the Dragon radar Goku was holding and frowned in the specific way she frowned when something wasn't functioning the way it should, and she couldn't immediately determine why. 6 balls were showing. The 7th was not. She took the radar from Goku, examined it, ran through the diagnostic sequence she had designed into it, and confirmed that the device itself was working correctly, all systems nominal. The 7th Dragon Ball simply was not showing up. She turned the problem over methodically. The radar detected the electromagnetic signature that each Dragon Ball continuously emitted, a unique signal strong enough to pass through rock and metal and water without significant degradation. The signal could not be blocked by ordinary matter. But biological matter, the complex, irregular composition of living organic tissue, was different. Under the right conditions, a sufficiently large biological mass could absorb and diffuse the signal completely, preventing it from reaching the detector. The 7th Dragon Ball had been swallowed by something. It was inside a living creature, something large enough to contain it, something whose digestive system had enclosed the ball completely. Without knowing what creature it was or where that creature currently was, the radar could not find it. The ball was unreachable through any ordinary method of searching. Oolong suggested this was implausible. He was not wrong that it was improbable, but improbable things happened in this world with a frequency that had stopped being surprising to most people in this group. Bulma began thinking about what kind of creature and what kind of water or habitat and what next step might produce an answer that the radar could not. Master Roshi had a suggestion. He offered it with the casual certainty of someone who had thought of it a while ago and was waiting for the conversation to arrive at a point where it was relevant to mention. His sister, older than him by a considerable margin, possessed of abilities that were different from his but arguably more immediately applicable to a situation like this one, operated a palace at some distance from where they were. She was a fortune teller in the most literal and least metaphorical sense available. She could find things, locate hidden objects, reveal information that was invisible to ordinary methods of detection. She could look at a situation and tell you what you could not see, and she was not in the habit of being wrong. Her name was Fortune Teller Baba, and she offered two paths to her services. Those who could pay her substantial fee would receive the answer they sought. Those who could not pay could earn the answer another way. Fight 5 of her champions in succession, win all 5 encounters, and the service would be provided at no cost. Roshi said this with the quiet confidence of someone who knew that the people in this group were capable of the alternative arrangement, and that the question of payment was not going to be a serious obstacle. Yamcha and Krillin both said they would go. Goku said he was going regardless. The group made plans. They boarded Yamcha's plane and turned in the direction of Baba's palace, taking the 6 Dragon Balls with them, carrying the still unresolved question of the 7th ball, moving forward in the direction the story was pointing. There was still one ball to find, there was still a wish to make, and the world, in its particular way, was not yet done arranging the meetings that needed to happen. Before we follow Goku toward Baba's palace, it is worth sitting for a moment in the wreckage of the Red Ribbon Army's headquarters, sitting in its quietness and its aftermath and the specific temperature of a place that has just stopped functioning as a place, and considering what the arc actually was. The Red Ribbon Army had been many things simultaneously. It had been a military organization of genuine sophistication, staffed by people who had dedicated their careers to it and believed in what they were doing. It had been a system of hierarchy and fear that had produced, in its lower ranks, beings like Ader, created as weapons and becoming something more complicated by the mere fact of being created as persons at all. It had been a machine built around the will of one specific man, and that man's will was not what any of the machine's operators believed it was. Toriyama had something specific in mind when he designed the arc's final revelation. The idea that an empire, an entire empire, with all its infrastructure and its violence and its organized ambition, could be built in service of something as small and personal and human as a wound about height, was funny in the way that human vanity becomes funny at a certain distance. But it was also, in its own way, sad. Red was not simply ridiculous. He was a person who had been hurt in ways that had never healed, who had misdirected the resulting pain into an enterprise that damaged many people and ultimately could not fix the damage inside himself, even if it had succeeded on its own terms. That gap between what he pursued and what he actually needed was the joke and the sadness together, and Toriyama held both of them without resolving them into either one. The Red Ribbon arc did something specific and lasting to Goku's story. It took him beyond the tournament, beyond the organized, observed, neutrally administered context of competition, and placed him in a world that did not operate by fair rules. The Red Ribbon Army was not fair. It killed civilians. It took children's relatives hostage. It hired assassins and used people as instruments without regard for the people. It was, in short, a version of the world that Goku had not encountered in the same comprehensive way before, and that his earliest education had not prepared him for except in the most general terms. And yet he moved through it with the same quality he brought to everything, the clean, undecorated directness of someone who understood what was wrong, and moved toward the center of it and responded to each obstacle as it appeared. He did not become harder or more guarded in the way that prolonged exposure to organized cruelty tends to make people harder and more guarded. He became more capable. Not more cynical, more capable. The distinction matters. What drove all of it remained consistent from beginning to end. He had promised Upa that he would bring Bora back. That promise lived at the center of every fight, every climb, every decision about what to do next. He was not accumulating power for its own sake. He was not trying to prove anything about himself to anyone, including himself. He was trying to keep a specific promise made to a specific child who was waiting at the base of a stone tower in the middle of a very large plain. He kept it. That was the whole of what the arc was, underneath everything else. The Red Ribbon Army did not simply end when its headquarters fell. It scattered, as things sometimes do when they are destroyed rather than dissolved, leaving fragments moving in various directions with the momentum they had accumulated before the destruction arrived. The science that had built Android 8, the combination of biological and mechanical components into something that existed between categories, survived the headquarters in the minds and notes of surviving researchers. That research had been ongoing for years. It had produced results. Those results had produced Aether and several other numbered androids before him, each one a step in the development of a program that the Army's commanders had always described as their highest priority scientific investment. Among those researchers was a man named Garrow. He had been deeply involved in the android program. He had been working on questions of biological-mechanical integration that went considerably further than what Aether represented. He had watched the fall of the headquarters, watched it, in whatever sense he still used that word at whatever stage of his own transformation he had reached by that point, and had not stopped. He did not stop. The work was too important, or too consuming, or both, he continued. What he eventually produced, 2 androids designated 17 and 18, and a larger creation that would come to define an entire saga, was not predictable from looking at Aether, but it was connected to Aether in the direct, uninterrupted line of a program that had never truly stopped. The arc had planted something in the story's deeper soil that would grow for years without showing itself, until it surfaced in a future that the Red Ribbon arc had quietly been preparing. Colonel Silver has the distinction of being the first Red Ribbon officer Goku encountered, and therefore the first person through whom the audience understood what kind of organization the Army actually was. He was designed to be impressive, tall, confident, physically capable, so that Goku's casual defeat of him would land with its full weight, and it did. His defeat was the first clear signal that the Army had fundamentally misunderstood what it was dealing with. But Silver was also, in small ways, a person. He had subordinates who answered to him. He managed logistics. He had been trusted with a solo operation in a remote location, which implied a track record of reliability. He was, in other words, someone with an internal history in this organization, someone who had earned his position through demonstrated effectiveness. His execution was carried out over a radio connection before he had fully regained consciousness from the fight with Goku. He was stumbling back toward his camp when the call was placed from the headquarters by someone following Red's order. He did not know it was coming. He had simply been the first to fail, and Commander Red's relationship with failure was exactly what the execution communicated to everyone else in the organization who witnessed it or heard about it afterward. Silver's death told us more about Red than Red's direct scenes had managed to convey at that point in the story. It established that the Red Ribbon Army was not a military organization with a principled code of conduct that happened to be directed toward bad ends. It was a personal empire administered by a man who measured everything against his own satisfaction, and his satisfaction was not a stable state that could be reliably achieved by anyone around him. That was a different and more specific kind of danger. Korin Tower is, in the architecture of Dragon Ball's geography, one of the most significant locations in the entire series. This is not obvious from its appearance. It is a pillar of stone planted in the middle of a plain, unremarkable in structure if extraordinary in height, surrounded by open landscape in all directions. There is nothing about it from the outside that announces what it is. But it is a threshold. It separates the ordinary world below from something above the clouds that operates by different rules and different timescales. Korin himself, at 800 years of existence, is ancient enough that his age functions less as a specific number and more as an indication of the kind of perspective that comes from having watched generations pass. He has given the ultra-divine water to everyone who has ever reached the top and proven capable of surviving it. He has watched those who could not survive it too. The tower also serves as the base of a structure that extends much further upward than Korin's domain, into realms the Red Ribbon arc does not yet concern itself with. Above Korin is another level, and above that another, each one further from the ordinary world and closer to something that the Dragon Ball universe would eventually need its characters to be capable of reaching. The foundations for those future necessities were being quietly laid here, in the middle of an arc about an army and a child's search for Dragon Balls, without anyone watching having any reason to know that was what they were seeing. Goku would return to Korin Tower many times over the course of his life. He would bring others to it. He would climb it again in circumstances that made his first climb seem uncomplicated. The tower never became less significant. It remained a threshold, permanent in the landscape, pointing upward at whatever came next. One of the things the Red Ribbon arc accomplished quietly, through accumulation rather than statement, was the establishment of the Dragon Ball world's geographic vastness. Goku encountered army soldiers in the wooded eastern regions, the frozen north, the coastal zones, and the open central plains. He found their infrastructure in a snow-buried tower, in an underwater cave network, in a jungle-adjacent sacred area, and finally in a headquarters positioned to administer all of these simultaneously. The army had been present and operational in all of these locations before Goku arrived. It had been conducting its own campaigns and managing its own operations and dealing with its own internal dynamics for years. The Dragon Ball pursuit was the newest of its activities, not the totality. The world into which Goku had wandered was not a world that had been waiting for him. It was a world that had been doing its own things for a very long time and would continue doing its own things around and after him. This quality, the feeling that the world exists independently of the protagonist and would keep existing whether he was paying attention to it or not, gave the arc a weight that lighter adventure stories do not always manage. It established something about the world's baseline, that human beings left to their own devices and given access to sufficient resources and sufficient ambition were capable of organizing themselves into forces that threatened entire populations. Frieza was alien and his scale was cosmic. The Red Ribbon Army was made of people who lived in the same world as Jingle Village and the coastal fishing towns and Korin's plain. Their cruelty was recognizable. Their ambition was the ordinary kind, scaled up. The Red Ribbon arc brought the Dragon Ball's function into sharper focus than any earlier story had. Prior stories had established that the balls existed, that gathering all 7 would summon a dragon, that the dragon would grant a wish, but the nature of that wish, what the dragon could actually do, where the limits were, what categories of change were available to someone who held all 7 balls, had not been examined closely. The arc's resolution required a specific wish, the restoration of a person who had died. Death in the Dragon Ball universe is not simple permanent finality. It is a transition. The soul continues in some form, moving into a different realm, while the body remains behind in the ordinary world. The gap between those two states, the separation that death introduces, is what a Dragon Ball wish, under the right conditions, could close. The conditions mattered. The manner of death, the time elapsed, and whether the person had previously been revived by a Dragon Ball wish were all factors. In Bora's case, the conditions could be met. He could come back. Goku did not know all of these conditions in precise terms. He simply said what he wanted to happen, and the dragon evaluated the request and found it within its power to fulfill. This established something important. The Dragon Balls were not simply a trophy to be collected or a symbol of the effort to collect them. They were a tool with specific, consequential, real-world effects. The effort to gather them was proportional to what they could actually do. And what they could do, reverse death, restore the irreversible, was substantial enough to justify every difficulty in the path, every climb, and every battle and every impossible distance crossed. Among all the characters who moved through the Red Ribbon arc, Upa might be the most quietly affecting, and the one who deserved the most careful attention, even though he received relatively little screen time. He was a child, young enough that his father's death registered not as an abstraction or a category of event, but as the specific, concrete, total absence of someone who had been present every day and was now simply not there. Bora had been everything that was stable and familiar and safe about Upa's world. The plains, the tower, The particular rhythms of that place, all of it had Bora woven through it, and then suddenly didn't. Goku sat with him briefly before beginning to climb. He did not have much to offer in the way of comfort. He was too direct, too earnest, too thoroughly himself to produce the careful distance that grief sometimes seems to require. He said what he intended to do. He climbed. He was gone for a long time. For Upa, waiting at the base of the tower, there was nothing to do but remain. Waiting is a specific kind of effort that is rarely credited as effort because it produces no visible output. Holding something in mind across a long and uncertain time, maintaining the hope that a stranger's promise will be kept without any evidence that it will be, is work of a particular kind. Upa did it without complaint and without appearing to require any particular acknowledgement that it was hard. When the dragon came and the light faded, and Bora was simply there, the large steady presence of him returned to the plane, no different in the ordinary particulars of his being. The ark's emotional logic completed itself without any announcement. A boy's father had been returned, a promise had been kept, the mountains stayed where they were, the world continued. That was enough. 7 Dragon Balls, placed in an open field under a sky that began to change in ways that felt less like weather and more like the atmosphere acknowledging that something was happening that exceeded its ordinary categories. The light shifted. The ground shook with a preliminary tremor that was not a warning but an introduction. The sky darkened in the particular way it always darkened when all 7 balls were gathered, going from blue to gray to something deeper that suggested not night, but attention. Shenron rose from the combined glow of all 7 spheres, the eternal dragon, enormous beyond the scale that eyes were prepared for, green and ancient and completely indifferent to the smallness of the beings looking up at him. His eyes were red. They communicated nothing except readiness, the absolute neutrality of something that exists to fulfill a function and is prepared to fulfill it now. He spoke in the way that very large, very old things speak, not with volume exactly, but with a presence that bypassed the ears and arrived somewhere more fundamental, somewhere that processed what he said before the mind had fully registered that he had spoken. He would grant one wish. He was bound by the magic of his creation and the terms of his existence to do exactly this. He would grant one wish. Speak. Goku spoke. Bora was returned to life in the way that Dragon Ball resurrections worked, not reconstructed from memory or rebuilt from description, but returned, as if a final sentence in a story that had been declared finished had been unwritten and rewritten into something else. One moment he was not. Then the world revised itself, quietly, and he was. Upa ran across the plain. With Bora restored, the immediate purpose that had driven Goku through the entire arc was complete. The promise had been kept. The arc's emotional center had been resolved in the only way that resolution was available. But there were still unfinished matters, because stories like this one do not end cleanly at their emotional peaks. They continue, trailing threads, into the next thing. The 6th Dragon Ball was now one of the scattered 7, which would fall to new locations around the world and require a year before they could gather energy sufficient for another summoning. The 7th, the one still inside some large animal somewhere, remained unlocatable. The problem Bulma had identified was not resolved by the wish. It was set aside while a more immediate purpose was served. Master Roshi's suggestion about fortune-teller Baba still stood. It was the clearest available path toward resolving the question of the 7th ball. And it opened the door to an adventure that existed in a slightly different register from the Red Ribbon conflict. Smaller in scale, stranger in atmosphere, with 5 unusual champions and a fighting arena over boiling water, and a reunion that Goku had not anticipated and could not have prepared for even if he had tried. The transition from the Red Ribbon arc to Baba's palace was not a sharp line. The story did not close and reopen. It simply continued, as journey stories tend to continue, one thing leading naturally to the next, one question answered and another appearing, the forward motion maintained by the simple fact that there was always still something ahead. Goku climbed onto the flying nimbus. His friends gathered themselves. The next departure was already beginning. There is a reason the Red Ribbon arc is remembered the way it is, held warmly in memory by people who grew up with Dragon Ball and revisited with affection by people who came to it later. It is not a flashy arc by the standards of what Dragon Ball eventually became. There are no planet-destroying energy blasts, no transformations that redefine the power scale, no cosmological stakes. There is a boy with a tail in the cloud, moving through a world that has been arranged against him, finding his way through it one encounter at a time. The arc's endurance comes from its variety and its texture. Each villain was genuinely different. Silver's professional pride, White's bureaucratic cruelty, Blue's obsessive precision, Tao's cold effectiveness, Red's wounded vanity, Black's late-arriving grief about what he had served. Each location was different. Each encounter required something slightly different from Goku. Not just more power, but more attention, more adaptability, more willingness to engage with whatever the situation actually was. And the arc had room for other kinds of stories running alongside Goku's. Ader's story, which was about what happens when a weapon declines to be a weapon, Upa's story, which was about waiting, Bora's story, which was about the cost of an organization's ambitions landing on someone who had done nothing to invite them. The world kept expanding outward from each of these, and the expansion felt real rather than decorative, because Toriyama gave all of them the small specific details that make imagined places feel inhabited. Akira Toriyama has spoken over the years, in various interviews and through the Daizonshu companion volumes, about Dragon Ball's early form and what it was intended to be. The original Dragon Ball, the series before the shift toward the Z era and its different priorities, had a specific texture. It was lighter, funnier, more interested in movement and discovery than in power escalation. It was about a gifted child navigating a world that was always larger than him, and the pleasure of that navigation was itself the point, not the destination that the navigation led toward. The Red Ribbon Army was the natural antagonist for that era, coherent enough to be taken seriously, diversified enough to produce a variety of encounters, human enough to carry the kind of motivation that gives a villain dimension beyond simple obstacle. Toriyama liked to give his antagonists personal stakes, liked to show the specific, sometimes small, sometimes strange reasons that people do terrible things. The Red Ribbon Army gave him space to do this at scale, with each officer carrying their own particular version of the underlying problem. The arc also established things that Toriyama was not yet certain he would develop. The android program was a background detail here, mentioned in Ader's existence, implied by his designation number and the program's logic, but not foregrounded or explained. In the years that followed, as Dragon Ball continued and became Dragon Ball Z, those background details became the foundations of things that would define the series. What the Red Ribbon arc planted, quietly and without announcement, the Z era would eventually harvest. One of the things that distinguishes the Red Ribbon arc in memory is the quality of the moments between confrontations, the spaces where the story breathed and showed you something other than combat and forward momentum. Goku landing the plane in the snow outside Jingle Village, his breath visible in the cold air, walking toward a cluster of buildings as simply as anyone walks toward any building they need to enter. The mayor wrapped in layers, the worry on every face, the particular resignation of a community that has been afraid for long enough that the fear has become the texture of ordinary life. Ader standing quietly in a corridor, neither threatening nor threatened, simply present, a being trying to understand, without any available vocabulary for the question, what it was actually supposed to be. The moment on Korin Tower when Goku stopped chasing and started watching, when the quality of his attention changed from pursuit to observation, and Korin acknowledged the change with the slight adjustment that a very old teacher makes when a student finally arrives at the right question. The plane at the base of the tower, wide and windless, Upa sitting with his patience, the specific silence of someone who has decided to trust a stranger with something large and is now waiting to find out whether the trust was placed correctly. Each of these moments existed briefly and without insisting on its own weight. They were available to the person watching or reading who was paying the kind of attention that quiet things require. They did not demand to be noticed. They simply were. And the arc was better for having them, and the story they inhabited was more real for the space they occupied within it. The Red Ribbon arc runs through approximately 50 to 70 episodes of the anime, depending on how generously one defines its boundaries. Where the pre-arc material ends and the arc itself begins, and where the arc ends and the subsequent fortune teller Baba section begins. It covers a larger geographic area than any previous Dragon Ball story. It introduces more named antagonists. It brings Goku into contact with more of the world than he had previously known about. And it resolves with a boy in a field, 7 balls on the open ground, a sky going dark, a dragon rising from the combined light of all 7 and waiting to hear what was needed. 1 wish stated plainly, 1 death reversed, 1 child running across the plain toward his father. That proportion, the enormous effort and the quiet conclusion, was always part of what Dragon Ball understood about itself at its best. The journey was the story. The wish was the sentence's final punctuation, not the climax, not the triumph, but the closing of one sentence so that the next one could begin. The next sentence was already forming. Baba's palace was waiting. The 7th Dragon Ball was inside something somewhere. The world was large and full of things still to find. Goku was small. He had always been small in the physical sense, and he had never understood why that should matter. He climbed onto the flying nimbus, and it rose under him with the steady warmth of something completely reliable. The plane fell away below. The sky opened above. The radar was in his pocket, and the next blink was already pointing somewhere. The ark was behind him now. All its towers and cold passages, and army bases and stone corridors and ancient chambers under the sea, all of it was behind him, settled into the past that he was always moving away from. Because moving away was the nature of a journey, and the journey had not ended. It simply had more to go. There is a sense in which the Red Ribbon arc is shaped the way real journeys are shaped, not as a single narrative with clearly labeled beginning and middle and end, but as a series of experiences that accumulate into something without ever quite announcing that they are accumulating. Each section complete in itself, each destination reached, each obstacle cleared, each question answered, but also all of it part of the same forward movement, the same momentum that did not stop because a single encounter had been resolved. The encounter with Silver led to the encounter with the Snowy North, which led to the tower, which led to the underwater cave, which led to General Blue, which led to Kame House, which led to Korin Tower, which led to the headquarters, which led to the field with 7 spheres and a dragon against a darkening sky. The arc did not have one climax. It had several arranged in ascending emotional weight. Tao's defeat at the base of Korin Tower was a climax of one kind, personal, urgent, the resolution of something that had felt irreversible. The assault on the headquarters was a climax of another kind, larger, more operatic, the elimination of a threat that had been operating throughout the entire arc. The summoning of Shenron was a climax of a third kind, quiet, short, soft, accomplished without drama in an open field, marked only by the light and the voice, and the moment when everything returned to what it should have been. And then the story kept going, because stories about journeys do not end at the destinations they pass through. They end when the wandering is done, and the wandering was not done. The sky was still open. The nimbus was still warm. Goku was still small, and the world was still large, and the next thing was already waiting, patient as a landscape that has been waiting for a very long time and knows how to continue waiting until the right footstep arrives. The Red Ribbon arc was, in the end, a story about the distance between what people chase and what they actually need. An army built on a wounded heart, a boy who climbed a tower in the clouds because he had made a promise to a child he had only just met. A gentle giant who was built to destroy and chose, from the very first moment the choice was available, to be something else. An organization's second in command who discovered, at the final moment, that everything he had believed in had been secretly redirected towards something small and selfish, and who could not absorb that knowledge without the knowledge changing him. All of it finding its way, in the unhurried fashion of good stories, to a field in the open air and 7 orange spheres, and the dragon rising against a dark sky, and a quiet wish, and a child's father breathing again. The stars do not always scatter the way we expect. The things we search for are not always where the search points us. The promise we think we are keeping turns out, sometimes, to be a different promise than the one we thought we started with. But the searching and the keeping and the forward movement through tower and cave and battle and cold plain, all of that is real. All of that accumulates into something that does not disappear when the search ends. Rest now. Let the plains spread out around you in the dark. Let the snow settle quietly on the slopes above Jingle Village. Let the golden cloud drift on some current of warm air above all of it. Let the dragon go back to wherever it goes when it is not needed. Let Upa sleep beside his father. The story will be here when morning comes. It always is. Thanks for spending this time in the Dragon Ball universe with me. If you'd like to keep drifting, another video is ready on the left of your screen. Maybe let it play as you close your eyes. Sleep might find you before the next story finishes.